The first light of day did not break so much as it breathed, a pale exhale over a sleeping continent. It drew thin lines of silver across a sky that had never known the weight of smoke from cities, never felt the hurried pulse of roads or the scratching geometry of fields. 300,000 years before this moment would ever be counted in calendars, Earth moved at an older tempo, patient, immense and utterly alive. A river, wide and slow and ancient beyond memory, uncoiled through a valley of grass and scattered trees. Its banks were stitched with reeds and the glossy leaves of water plants, crowded with insects whose hum rose and fell like a single living instrument. Herds moved at the water's edge, round-shouldered aurochs with heavy horns, lean antelopes startled into sharp flights, and massive shaggy shapes that left deep ovals in the damp sand. Higher on the slopes, the trees gathered and thickened, trunks spiraling in bark the color of ash and charcoal, branches webbed with moss. Light came through those leaves in long, soft columns, as if the forest itself were made of quiet rain. Beneath a curve of overhanging rock, a tribe woke to the morning. Smoke, thin, reluctant, lifted from the previous night's embers. A boy, not yet old enough to carry a spear, breathed on them gently, coaxing orange from black. Others stirred on woven mats of reed and grass. There was the sound of a cough, of a yawn, of a quiet laugh quickly smothered. The tribe had slept with the rock at their back and the valley before them. They had slept the way their grandparents had, and the way their grandchildren would if the seasons allowed it. Their leader stood early. He had many names over the seasons, some joking and some earned, but often they called him Tarik, or simply the one who looks far. Scars pale against his brown skin crossed his shoulder and climbed his ribs like the white roots of a tree. He stepped to the edge of the shelter and listened. Wind moved the reeds, running its fingers through them. Somewhere far off, a big cat gave a short, harsh cough. His eyes traced the river until the water became brightness, and then only light. Behind Tarik, a woman named Sarah separated tools into small piles. She checked the edges of flint blades by drawing a fingertip lightly across them, careful as a person handling moonlight. To the side, two girls tied their hair with fibers soaked and twisted until the strands were strong. Oren, broad-shouldered and impatient, propped a spear against the rock and tested the balance of another, lifting and lowering it with his palm. An older woman, Nima, hummed to the rhythm of her own thoughts while she sorted roots by their smell, mild, peppery, bitter, because in this world a mistake was marked on the tongue. Day began as it always did, a weaving of small, certain motions into a wide pattern. Their life was a pattern like migrating birds in the sky. It did not need a plan written in words. The hunters would move out first, 3 of them at a time, because 3 was a number the land had taught them. It was enough to encircle, enough to carry back, enough to be mourned or celebrated together. The gatherers would stay within the echo of the rock's shadow, near the reed beds and the berry shrubs that made small promises with their color. The oldest would watch the youngest and clean the tools and remember the stories, because the tribe needed remembering as much as it needed meat and water. Before they left, Tarik knelt and pressed his palm to the ground. He did this not out of worship but out of habit, a practiced asking that had once been taught to him under the same overhanging rock. The earth was cool. It kept the night in its skin long after the sky had given up darkness. His fingers found a place where the soil was dented by the half-moon of a hoof, still damp along the edges. He looked at Oren and lifted his chin. Oren smiled briefly, a flash of boy still stitched to the man. They set off along the contour where grass met trees. The spears rode easy on their shoulders, and their feet knew where to fall. Birds rose before them like thrown handfuls of shadow. Every few minutes the hunters stopped and listened, not to the obvious, not to the river and its steady breath, but to the small mistakes in the world. A twig where no twig should break, a sudden quiet in a place that had been noisy, a scent pushed wrongly by the wind. The trail curved toward the river and then away again. It lay like string in a child's hand, looping around bushes and skirting patches of thorn. The prints were spaced widely. The animal had been moving without care, confused not by fear but by the morning's comfort. Tarik's mouth shaped a word, aurochs. Oren nodded and drew a line on his thigh with a dirty fingertip, a sign that meant not alone. Smaller prints flanked the larger ones, a meeting of roots near water. The hunters adjusted their path to downwind. Back at the shelter, the day's quieter labor unfolded. Sarah taught the girls the way a flake should detach from a flint core, angle, pressure, angle again. A good flake felt right in the hand even before it cut. It felt like the completion of a promise. Nima turned and turned a length of sinew, smoothing it with fat from a small leather pouch that held many such secrets. A baby woke and set up a sudden cry. A boy brought a scrap of roasted root to share. An elder pointed to a bird and named it by the time of day it usually called, because names grew from uses and habits. Clouds gathered by the mountains. They were not dark yet, but they were thoughtful. Wind explored the cliff face and found its favorite angles. The river that had seemed silver at dawn now carried the yellow of the widening light. Fish moved under that gold as if they were strokes of a painting that had not finished deciding what it would be. The hunters found what they had expected, and also what they had not. The herd stretched away in a smelling line of bodies, large heads swinging like slow bells. Calves pushed against their mothers' flanks. Flies clung and were brushed away and clung again. But between the herd and the cover of the trees lay a page written in claw. The ground had been combed by something that pushed and scraped and leapt. Hair lay caught in grass and in a small tangle where a bush had fought back. Tarek crouched by it and breathed the air over the hair. The scent spoke in a language older than their tribe. Thick, sharp iron under sunlight. He did not say cat. He tapped the ground twice with his knuckles and Oren's jaw tightened. They waited. Waiting was half of hunting, and it tasted different every day. Sometimes it tasted like dust and sometimes like time itself, like a slow river in the mouth. Hours could hang and not fall. The aurochs moved, fed, looked up, moved again. The cat did not show. In the scrub, a flock of small birds made a fast, tight, invisible decision and all lifted at once. Tarek's eyes went to the place they had left. Nothing. Then a ripple of grass. He signaled with his shoulder, the smallest suggestion of a breath, and the three of them drifted to a new angle of wind. They saw it only when the land allowed them. It came like the edge of a shadow, golden, tawny and huge, with a head too heavy for silence and teeth too long for peace. Its whiskers moved like roots testing the soil of air. It passed where the herd had been and paused to turn its face toward the warmth rising from the valley. Its tail wrote slow words against the grass. Tarek counted 3 heartbeats and then stopped counting because the counting would change the world. They let the cat pass. There were hunts that belonged to men and hunts that belonged to other mouths. The tribe knew both. They moved back, then farther still, and only when the cat had become a rumor in the trees did they speak aloud. Oren laughed softly with the bright relief of a man who has not yet learned how easily luck can be embarrassed. Tarek did not smile, but his eyes softened. On the river's far bank, smoke rose in a thin blue ribbon from a place that should have been empty. The line of it trembled, then steadied, then trembled again, as if the air were trying to decide whether to keep the secret. The 3 men stood in a row without meaning to. Others, Oren said, and the word made his mouth feel strange. They were not the first to drink this water, not the only to sleep under this cliff. They had always known that knowledge was not the same as seeing. They returned at a pace just short of urgency. The valley seemed to have rearranged itself while they were away. The trees leaned, or the light shifted, or the birds took new paths through the wind. At the shelter, a new fire had been coaxed from last night's coals. Fish lay on a flat stone near the heat, their skins blistering, flesh singing into an aroma that ran all the way to the river and tried to bait the herons. Sarah looked up first and read Tarek's face like a hunter reads ground. She did not speak. He did not waste words. Across the water, he said, "Smoke." Nima's hands paused on the sinew as if a muscle in the world had cramped. The girls glanced at one another with an excitement carefully wrapped in fear. The old man who kept most of the stories, Kesso, drew a slow breath and released it as a fragment of a tale. "Where smoke climbs," he murmured, "mouths speak. Sometimes they speak our names." The tribe did not close their eyes to eat. They ate with the world looking at them and looked back. They ate without talking about fights or fear, and in this silence they were as eloquent as any counsel. When food was done, Sarah licked her fingers clean and coated them with ash and drew lines on the rock. Thin, uncertain lines that would wash away in the next rain or the next mood. Lines that meant river, here, smoke, there, herd here, cat, everywhere. Tarek watched her hand move and set his teeth lightly together. He had no desire to collect marks on stone. He preferred the living marks in his mind, The echo of bird calls as they changed with the hour, the color of a berry bush, when it began to fail at its own promise, the weight of the air before rain. But he did not stop her because he had seen the shapes that appear when the same hand leaves the same mark many times. A map was a kind of memory, and memory was a kind of tool, and tools kept children alive. Afternoon leaned toward the long light. Shadows lengthened until even small stones had spears. The herds became dark boats on the river grass. Across the water, the thin column of smoke faded, then thickened, then disappeared, folded back into the trees as if embarrassed by its own visibility. The tribe did not cross. They left a symbol instead, a small pile of river shells arranged in a pattern that meant "We are here." If anyone on that bank read the same language of arrangement. Sarah placed the last shell with gentle stubbornness. Evening stepped through the trees and the air smelled a little like stone cooling. Frogs began speaking the names of their own small territories. The rock at the tribe's back gathered a heat that would feed them in the dark, slow warmth returning itself to the skin of anyone leaning there. Tarek let his spear rest, point down into the earth. Children tumbled through the grass under the indifferent supervision of a star that would be visible later. Kesso cleared his throat in the way that meant he would tell a story, and in the way that meant he would also tell a warning. Before our mothers' mothers, Kesso said, the river wore a different bed. It slept over there. He pointed with a bent knuckle. The land remembers where the river slept. The land also remembers where strangers sang. Sarah cut a glance at the far bank. Smoke could mean hunger, she said, or many mouths to make it. Hunger is a kind of stranger too, Kesso replied and smiled without humor. In the dark the world did not disappear, it changed medium. Sound became touch, smell became map, time became something heard as well as felt. Fires were coaxed to stronger life and ringed with stones. The tribe sat close but not crowded, leaving lanes open for movement and for caution. Tarek stared into the heart of the flame and did not see faces in it. He saw only wood finding a new form and returning its stored sunlight back to the night. When the first stars arrived, Oren asked, "Do they look the same from across the water?" It was not a question about stars. The elders let the question hang where it could be useful later. Sarah fed the fire until it began to speak in voices the children wanted to answer. The baby slept with its mouth open to receive dreams. Nima closed her eyes, opened them, smiled at nothing and at everything. A sound broke the night, the short dry sound of a foot misplacing its weight on a stick. The tribe did not leap up. They let their eyes grow wide and their breathing slow. Tarek rose and moved with the flame on his face like a mask. He lifted a burning brand into the air so the light fell beyond the ring of their seating and into the grasses behind them. He saw only grass, then shadow, then the bright line of two eyes set low. The eyes blinked once. A hyena, rangy and arrogantly patient, stood at the edge of the tribe's circle. It knew the measure of this place, the weight of a thrown stone, the speed of a running man, the pressure of many together. It would try the edges and carry messages back to its own circle. Tarek spoke quietly, and the sound of his voice was more fence than firelight. The hyena stood, then sat, then stood, then withdrew, leaving the smell of curiosity behind it like a gift no one wanted. The tribe did not sleep all at once. Sleep was a blanket too valuable to share without a plan. Two would sit with the fire, two would lie down with spears laid along their arms like tame branches, and two would sleep so hard that even dreams would not require effort. The night passed in these layers, watch, rest, like reeds stacked and woven into something more than reeds. When the moon rose, light pooled in these shallow places of the land. A mist formed from the river's quiet breath and moved inward, as if learning to walk. Frogs fell silent in a small sudden agreement. Across the water, something flashed and faded. The ghost of a flame perhaps, or the last eye of a dying fire closing itself. Tarek watched the far bank until the watching became a kind of drowsy prayer, not spoken, not owed to anyone, only present. He thought of the cat and of the herd and of the shells arranged on the ground. He thought of Sarah's charcoal lines and Kesso's bent finger pointing to old riverbeds. He shaped these things into a feeling he could use in the morning.
Before sleep found him, he lifted his face to the stars and, without speaking to the night or to the future, he made a simple promise to look far and to bring the tribe along with his looking. Between one breath and the next, a wind changed. It came from the mountains now, thin and clear as water, bringing with it a knot of scents, wet stone, distant rain that had not yet fallen, the cold dust of higher ground. The fire's smoke bent and wrote new words in the air. Nima opened her eyes, and though she did not smile, she allowed her chest to loosen around her heart. Change was walking toward them on quiet feet. It would be slow because everything here was slow, and it would be sure because everything here was sure. At that hour, when night loosens its hope but will not yet admit defeat, Kesso spoke again, not to the circle, but to the dark itself. "We are small," he said, not miserably but with the easy acceptance of a man discussing the shape of a familiar hill. "We are small, but we carry each other's fire." His hand drifted to the spiral scar on his forearm and rested there, as if to say, this too is a man. Whoever watched from the far bank, if any eyes watched at all, would have seen only a faint breathing of coals under the rock, and a single figure standing, and the quiet choreography of a tribe that had learned to make a home inside the space between caution and courage. If you wish to return to this valley, if you want to walk with this tribe as they learn from the river, from the storms and from the strangers whose smoke wrote their presence in the sky, follow their trail again with us. Subscribe so you do not lose the path when the season turns and the story moves on. The night folded itself a final time. Beyond the eastern ridge, the sky thinned to gray. The river's surface, which had seemed black and intimate as a secret, remembered the sun and became a mirror for it. Birds began listing their opinions of the morning. Tarek stretched his arms until the joints answered. Sarah, eyes shadowed by not enough rest and exactly enough purpose, rose and kicked at the smallest embers, so they would not pretend to be safe. Oren watched the far bank as if he could will it into speaking. The new day waited, gathering itself. It would bring a crossing, or it would bring patience. It would bring meat, or it would bring hunger. It would bring friendship, or the idea of it sharpened into something else. The tribe turned their faces toward the river and breathed with it. They did not know yet what the smoke had meant. They did not know yet what the storms in the mountains were preparing. They did not know yet how wide a journey can become once you take a step past your own footprint, but they would, and the valley would remember.
Morning opened like a low, careful door. The valley's skin shivered under a faint breeze, and the river slipped past with the modest confidence of an animal that knows its path by heart. The thin column of smoke that had risen from the far bank the day before was gone, as if the trees had folded it into their own breath and would not return it. The tribe ate quietly, a little fish, a slice of roasted tuber, the tang of berries that stained the tongue. When the sun lifted, the air tasted of stone warming, and the reed beds began to murmur. Tarek stood at the edge of the rock shelter and counted. People, tools, clouds, everything that could be counted before it turned into weather and luck. Oren waited with a spear that had become an extension of his reach, bouncing faintly against his palm with each heartbeat. Sarah checked a coil of sinew and retied the bindings on a younger hunter's spear, pulling the knots toward herself with small, precise tugs. Nima, who had known more seasons than most, looked at the river with a face that could read the day's first paragraph before anyone else had found the letters. "Meet," Oren said softly, not as a demand or a request, but as a promise to the hours ahead. "Meet," Tarek agreed. His voice had the plain gravel of the riverbed, and care. The plan was not new. The land wrote it over and over, and people learned to trace it with their bodies. The hunters would move east along the slope, where the ground rose gently, and then broke into a series of gullies that squeezed the animals' paths. Deer liked those gullies. The walls offered cover, the bottoms held water long after rain. If the wind cooperated, the men would drive the herd toward the narrowest throat, where a spear could become certainty and not an experiment. They left as three, because three could become a triangle that closed, and a triangle could become a circle, and a circle could become a home around a fallen body. Tarek led, Oren followed. The third hunter, lean and careful, was Jara, whose feet could speak to dry leaves without being overheard. Sarah watched them go until they were swallowed by trees that accepted them only because the men had learned to enter as if the forest were a sleeping animal. Back at the shelter, tasks braided themselves without knots. The girls collected long reeds for weaving. Queso sorted stones by a secret logic of shine and fracture that only he could explain, if he ever chose to. A child practiced throwing a short stick at a circle of scraped earth, learning the feel of distance in her bones. Sarah moved among them, listening to the way work hummed when it was done right. She did not micromanage, she nudged. When two hands reached for the same tool, she let them decide between themselves and then said, only after they had solved it, "Good." The word landed like a small warm stone in cold hands. The hunters climbed to where the slope thinned into a ledge. From there they could see a long swath of grassland, banded by animal trails, as if braided by invisible hands. Tarek raised his nose to the wind, not dramatically, not like a story from another tribe, but with the economy of a man who had led people into danger and brought them back again. The air came from the west, river cool, leaf sour, promising. He pointed with his chin, and the three slid into motion. They moved with the rhythm of listening. The first section was open. They crossed it quickly, the sun warm on their backs. The second section carried the smell of old bones, a place where hyenas like to teach patience to hunger. They moved beneath that signal, bodies a little closer, weight shifted to the front of their feet. The third section was their own kind of language, a shallow gully, its dry floor scrolled with the tracks of many lives. Here the prints of small deer overlapped the blunt, careful rectangles of boar. A deeper imprint showed where a heavy animal had stumbled. A scatter of claw marks told of a quick failed pursuit. Tarek crouched and touched a print with 2 fingers. He did not need to taste the earth to know its age. The edges were still sharp, the fine grains unsettled. Now he breathed, and the word folded itself into the wind so softly that even the leaves could not complain. They followed the gully as it curved, the walls closing like hands around a secret. Ahead, the ground narrowed to a throat. A stand of trees leaned over the passage, their roots knuckled into the earth like old fists. Beyond, the light opened, brighter, warmer, and they could see grass moving in a way that was not wind. Jara froze with 1 foot suspended. He had stepped directly into the boundary where chance becomes choice. A deer, pale-bellied and alert, stared back at him from a patch of shadow. 2 others grazed beyond, ears twitching, legs coiled as if they were arrows, and the earth was a bow. Oren lifted his spear. Tarek's hand moved once, and the spear went down. Wait, the hand told him. Not for a better target, this was already good, but for the breath that gathers in a body before it becomes motion. The deer flicked flies with an economy that mocked the human's longing. The river's voice rose and fell in the distance, as if it were telling the same story again with different words. From above on the lip of the gully came a short clatter, stone on stone too regular to be accident. Oren's eyes cut upward. A thin shadow moved between the trunks, then another. People, not many, 2, perhaps 3. Not the tribe. These bodies did not belong to the pattern Oren knew, not in the slant of their shoulders or the angle at which they held their spears. Tarek's jaw set. The deer twitched undecided between the good grass and the wrong sound. A gust of wind shifted, bringing them the ghost of smoke, old and threadbare. The deer chose the world. They bounded, white flashes through the brush, and the chance unraveled like rotten fiber. The men held still until silence reassembled itself around them. Tarek did not look up again toward the shadows on the ridge. To look was to invite a conversation he was not ready to have. He gestured with 2 fingers, back then around, and the 3 of them melted out of the gully's throat and into a skein of trees where light broke into manageable pieces. The hunt had become a different thing. It was no longer just hunger's answer. It was also a way of speaking to those unknown men without words. They looped east, keeping the wind in their mouths. For a while the forest held them tightly, then the trunks opened like curtains, and the stage changed. They stood above a shallow basin that had once been a pond, but now was a trick of green and mud. A band of antelope moved along its rim, stopping to nibble, to look, to nibble again. The herd's edges blurred into grass so perfectly that if you relaxed your eyes, they vanished. Only the metronome of ears gave them away. Tarek's hand cut the air. You there, wait. Now, Oren slipped left, using a low line of brush as a friend. Jara moved right, stepping on stones when he could, on roots when he could not, never on the open earth where the sound of his foot would travel. Tarek took the center path, not because it was safest, but because it let him see both his men and the herd in one unbroken sentence. They all became slow, slow enough to make snails seem reckless, slow enough to let their breathing become the forests. At the edge of the basin, luck and skill shook hands. A young antelope, distracted by a fly that liked the taste of its inner ear, drifted a few steps farther from the herd. That was enough. Jara lifted his spear and slid it along his palm until the balance felt like a memory. Orin, mirrored on the other side, did the same. Tarek watched the wind without watching the wind. He read its touch on his cheek and the leaves' small applause. The throw, when it came, was not dramatic. The spear left Jara's hand as if it had decided to walk and found itself faster than expected. It struck the antelope behind the shoulder, a little high. The animal leaped, a question mark closing violently, and the herd exploded into motion. Orin's spear flew and missed by the width of a breath, rattling through grass, then striking earth with a thick, swallowed sound. Tarek did not throw, he ran. The basin's far side rose in a scramble of dirt and stone. The wounded antelope took that path, the spear in its side writing a crooked punctuation down its ribs. Tarek closed the distance with a pace that had been trained, not by pride but by necessity. He gained the ridge as the animal crested it, slipped on a patch of loose dust, recovered, and leaped again. Tarek thrust with his spear, low and forward, feeling the wood bend, feeling the point find depth. The antelope shuddered and folded, its legs trying one last arrangement, but the earth called it down. Silence does not return after a kill, it expands. The breath that had been caught in 3 human throats let go all at once. Orin reached them, then Jara, and together they stood around the animal. Tarek put his hand on its flank, not as apology, not as triumph, but as acknowledgement. The heat under his palm was the last argument of life. He closed the antelope's eyes with 2 fingers. Jara spoke a word in a tone that belonged to his mother and to her mother before her. Orin nodded, once. The men adjusted their world to include this meat and the work it would require. They dressed the animal where it lay, because the carry would be long and the sun had begun its slow tilt. Jara opened the body with a flake so sharp it seemed like a thought made into stone. Orin kept watch, his head turning on its stem in a steady, unconcerned rhythm that meant absolute concern. Tarek bound the meat in the animal's own hide and tested the knots, sealing smell inside with mud and crushed leaves. Flies arrived, the way news arrives, first as rumor then as crowd. They were discouraged, not convinced. Halfway through the work a call drifted across the basin, not a bird, not an animal they knew, a human sound, high, thin, unfriendly only because it was unrecognized. Orin looked to Tarek. Tarek did not return the glance. He kept his hands on the knots, finishing what must be finished. We go along the ridge, he said. We walk in the trees. We do not run. We do not speak unless the ground asks us to. The men lifted the load together, each shoulder taking a story's worth of weight. The walk back was shorter than the walk out because it carried purpose. The forest noticed them and then lost interest, the way it does with anyone who follows the rules of moving well. Once the smell of cat rolled through a low place in the air, and the 3 closed ranks, a shape that could defend itself becoming more true for the way they did not discuss it. Twice they paused to listen to water speaking to stone. 3 times, Tarek thought of the smoke across the river, and each time the thought arrived with a taste like old acorns, bitter and nutritious. At the shelter, Sira saw the men before the children did, and set a space with leaves and tools. The children came next, joy sparking up their legs into their eyes as if their bodies were chimneys. Queso stepped forward with a piece of firewood and placed it beside the rest, not because the fire needed more, but because arrival and offering belonged together. The tribe accepted the meat, and by accepting it they accepted the day, with its strange call and its near-missed spear and its quick kill more clean than many. Nima sang as the meat cooked, not a song with words, not even a melody, but a line of sound that ran from her throat to the smoke, and then out over the valley. The tribe ate while the light turned a color like warm copper. They ate with the discipline of people who know that plenty is a kind of weather, and weather changes. When everyone had taken what was theirs, and a little of what was not, Sira wiped her hands on grass, and pointed with her chin toward the river.
They watched us, she said simply. Or we watched them, Queso said. Which is the same shape viewed from another side. Will they come? A child asked, unable to keep the thing inside now that it had heat and a name. If they are like us, Sierra said, they will come hungry, or curious, or both. Curious hunger, Queso murmured, and began to tell a story about a wolf who wanted to know the names of the stars, and what happened when it learned them. Evening laid itself down along the ridge. The river released a cool voice that the skin could hear. The tribe cleaned the tools, rubbed fat into wood to keep it from drinking too much of the world, arranged the hide to dry into something useful. Tarek took a length of meat to a flat stone and cut it thin, until each strip took the air like a leaf does. He built a rack over low embers, not a blaze, and the smell of smoke found the meat and asked. Oren watched, fascinated, a boy inside the man once more, and Jara measured his own breath against the slow lift of the drying strips. Across the water, the trees held whatever secrets they had. No smoke now, no call, only the sense that the far bank had learned the shape of the tribe's day, and was making plans in a language composed of eyebrows and hand signs and the movement of feet through grass. The night did not arrive all at once. It drew lines around the visible and invited the invisible to step forward politely. The fire did what fires do, ate quietly, and gave light back as a way of apologizing. The tribe sat in a rough crescent that left space for the world to pass through them. Queso's tail wandered down into a low ripple, then vanished. A child's sigh found the space where it had been and fit there perfectly. Tarek waited until the day had finally admitted it was done. Then he spoke to all of them without raising his voice. We were seen, he said. We heard them, above the gully. If they come, we stand as we are. We do not show teeth unless teeth are shown to us first. We keep the children behind the fire and the elders just behind the children. If they do not come, Sierra asked, because someone had to ask so that the shape of the conversation would be complete. We go to the water at first light, Tarek said. We leave a sign again, a different one. We give them a chance to be as careful as we are. Oren shifted, restless because blood that had run today wanted encore. We could cross, he said. We could, Tarek allowed. We could cross and find welcome, or we could cross and find a spearhead in the first sentence. We are not a story that wants to be shortened. The fire found a dry pocket of resin and popped softly, as if punctuating his thought. Sierra looked at the meat strips and turned a few with a green twig. The fat hissed and made a sound that almost convinced the body that it was raining. Nima worked a knot out of a length of rawhide and succeeded with the tiny, satisfied exhale of a woman who had done more difficult things many times. Above them, the stars opened like seeds in a wind that no one could see. The watchers took their stations, 2 at a time, as always. The rest slept, or stood near sleep stood up and negotiated. Oren took the second watch. He liked the feel of night against his skin. He liked being there when danger decided to try the edges. He did not name this liking pride. He named it readiness, because names matter, and men learn to choose them with care. Late, much later, a sound came from the river that was not the river, the careful lift of a foot from shallow water, the soft sealing of mud, when weight leaves it. Oren did not move. He narrowed his breath until it could be hidden behind his teeth. Across the fire, Tarek was already looking at him. The 2 men did not need to speak to share the understanding that walked between them. At the edge of the camp's circle of light, a figure appeared. Not cat, not hyena, human, shorter than Tarek, broader across the shoulders. The figure did not carry a spear loosely. It carried it with the ownership of a tool that has a name. It took 1 step closer, then another, and then stopped in the place where any person would stop if they were not yet sure how to arrange their face. Sierra's hand found a child's shoulder and stayed there, not tight, not loose, exactly right. Queso leaned forward as if listening to an old memory. Nima did not look up. She continued to worry the knot, which refused to be either finished or abandoned. The figure raised an open hand, palm out. The gesture was not theirs, and yet it was. Even without the shared language of words, some shapes belong to all bodies. Tarek rose slowly. The weight of his leadership settled on his bones the way dew settles on grass evenly without complaint. He showed his own open hand. The night breathed in and then held that breath. Then the figure lowered its hand and turned and walked away, quiet as a heron, leaving a pool after deciding the fish are not worth the trouble. The river accepted it, and the dark swallowed it, and the camp circle of light remained exactly the same size it had been before, which felt like a story failing to admit its next chapter. Oren let out the breath he had been saving. Tomorrow, he whispered, but to whom he spoke? Tarek, Sira the figure. The river was a choice even he had not made. The tribe slept the rest of the night, inside a listening thinner than silence. When dawn began to think about beginning, Tarek stood and turned his face toward the water. He pictured shells arranged in patterns. He pictured ash marks on stone. He pictured the careful way a stranger had offered an open palm and then taken it back again. The new day would ask for meat again, yes, and tools, and decisions about where to place feet. But it would also ask for something that could not be butchered or napped or braided. They would answer, but slowly. The world was older than urgency, and hunger that included curiosity fed the body differently. If you wish to walk with them beyond this moment, beyond the next ridge, beyond this river, stay close to them. The fire. Let your path join theirs. Subscribe and return when the next light touches the valley, so the trail does not fade between one telling and the next. The sun lifted just far enough to press a long, thin line the river's spine. Birds made small, surprised exclamations in the reeds. The tribe rose to meet the morning with their ordinary courage, which is the kind that the hunt had been taken, the meat was drying, and the strangers had become more than a rumor. Between those facts, a narrow path opened, and Tarek led them onto it, step after deliberate step. They did not know what the open had, just as yesterday they had not known what the thin column of smoke meant, but understanding can be hunted as surely as meat can, and the tribe had the skills for hunting many things. As the day gathered itself, the river kept moving, willing to witness whatever words were about to be written across its surface. But the first hunt was done, the next began in the spaces between breaths.
The river woke before the sun. It moved in the half-light with the confidence of something older than the hills that cradled it, carrying the night's coolness and the taste of far-off rains down to the valley. Mist lay low across its surface, drifting in loose sheets, curling and breaking around half-submerged stones. In the grey quiet, herons stood like carved statues, necks folded, eyes sharp. Fish broke the surface with small, casual mouths, leaving circles that traveled outward until they became part of the water's larger pattern. By the time the sky's edge began to glow, the tribe was already awake. Tarek crouched at the water's edge, filling a skin bag and listening, not to the river's loudest voices, but to the softer conversations under them. The murmur of eddies against root clusters, the faint tick of pebbles shifting in the current. These were details worth knowing. They told him if the water carried new silt, if a bank had collapsed upstream, if heavy rains had fallen beyond the mountains. Sarah was beside him, washing a bundle of reeds for weaving. She worked them through her fingers slowly, stripping away the soft, useless outer layers until only the strong fibers remained. The river's smaller, she said, not as complaint but as observation. It remembers the heat, Tarek answered. It will be smaller again before the rains. Oren waded in up to his knees, standing still until the minnows began to move past him again, ignoring the new shape in their world. He held a fish spear loosely in one hand, the other ready to flick the shaft forward at the first flash of silver large enough to be worth the throw. Behind him, two children balanced on a low branch that leaned over the water, daring each other to dip their toes in. Sarah glanced back once and the children froze mid-laugh, then grinned guiltily and scrambled down. The river was more than water. It was a road, a market, a teacher, and a judge. It offered fish, mussels, and waterfowl. It gave reeds for weaving and clay for shaping. It showed where herds came to drink and where predators came to watch them. It could also take meat swept away by sudden floods, canoes overturned, footprints erased before they could tell their story. The tribe lived because of the river, and sometimes in spite of it. Queso squatted near a shallow pool at the edge, using a smooth stone to crack open mussel shells. He checked each one's smell and color before handing the meat to Nima, who laid them on a flat rock to dry in the sun. "This one's too old," he said of a particularly large shell, tossing it aside. "Not all big things are worth taking." By mid-morning, the tribe spread out along the riverbank like beads on a string. Gatherers moved slowly among the reeds, plucking the longest stems and slicing them free with flint knives. Hunters crossed to a narrow sandbar in the middle of the current, where footprints could be read like sentences. Here were the splayed prints of a large bird, claws deep in the wet sand. Here were the overlapping crescents of antelope hoofs, sharp-edged from last night. Here was the single round depression of a cat's forepaw, placed with deliberate weight before disappearing into the grass. Tariq studied that paw print for a long moment. It was old enough to have softened at the edges, but not so old that the river had stolen its story completely. "It passed before dawn," he said quietly. "It drank here, and then crossed toward the hill." Oren knelt beside him. "Alone?" Tariq nodded once. This time, the river's bend offered shade by late morning, and the tribe gathered there to work. Sarah wove mats for drying meat. Jara scraped the hide from the previous day's hunt, stretching it between stakes to keep it flat. Nima prepared a basket of boiled roots, their skins split and curling back, ready to be mashed into a paste for storage. The children carried small bundles of sticks for the fire, trading them for bits of roasted fish as reward. A heron landed nearby, folding its long wings with deliberate slowness, as if demonstrating the proper way to arrive in any place, without startling it. Queso watched it spear a fish with a movement so quick it seemed like a mistake in the air. "The river gives," he murmured, "but only to those who ask the right way." By afternoon, the sun pressed down hard, turning the stones along the shore hot to the touch. The river narrowed here, its current fast and clean over a bed of pale gravel. Oren and Jara worked together, standing midstream and driving fish into a shallow pocket between two logs. The water churned silver as dozens of bodies darted and turned. In a coordinated movement born of long practice, they plunged their spears down together, lifting 3 fish between them. Sarah, watching from the bank, let herself smile briefly before returning to her work. Farther downstream, Tariq and 2 others scouted a place where the bank dropped sharply into deep water. He studied the current's pull, the overhanging branches, the marks on the mud where something heavy had slid in. "Crocodile," he said finally. The others shifted uneasily, scanning the water's still surface. "Not today," Tariq added, but his voice carried the weight of a warning that would last longer than the afternoon. When the sun began to sink, the river changed its voice. The bright shatter of light on water softened into a lower, smoother tone. Shadows stretched across the current, making it harder to see where shallow became deep. Birds returned to roost, their wing beats stitching the air. The tribe gathered what they had taken from the day: fish strung together by reeds, baskets of mussels, bundles of fresh-cut stalks, a skin of clean water for the camp. They moved back toward the rock shelter in a slow procession, the river's sound following them like a companion who had walked as far as it would go. At camp, the fire was coaxed back to life, and the smell of cooking rose to meet the cooling air. Children dozed early, their heads against their mothers' sides. The elders sat together, speaking in low voices about the pattern of fish this season, the bend in the river where the current had grown faster, the memory of a flood that had come in the middle of the night many seasons ago. Tariq stood apart for a moment, watching the line of water vanish into the dark. He thought of the strangers, how easily they could have followed the river to find his people, how many other eyes might be watching from its hidden bends. He did not fear the river's secrets, he respected them, but respect was not the same as trust. As the fire settled into a steady glow, he spoke to the tribe. "The river feeds us, but it speaks to others too. We are not the only ones who drink here. If you see footprints that are not ours, remember them. If you see signs of a camp, tell me. The river brings life, but it also brings company." Queso chuckled, low and knowing. "Life and company are the same thing," he said. "It's only trouble if you forget that." The tribe laughed quietly, letting the words sink into the evening like stones dropped into deep water. Above them, the first stars began to appear, their reflections trembling faintly in the river's skin. The day had gone quiet long before the sun surrendered, It was the kind of quiet that made even the river slow its voice, a subtle tightening in the air as if the valley itself were holding its breath. Shadows stretched early, pooling under the trees and spilling out across the grass, and the wind began to move differently. Shorter gusts, less patient. The tribe knew this quiet. It was a warning stitched into the land's oldest fabric. The fire under the rock overhang was already lit by dusk, its circle of light licking at the stone ceiling above. Sarah tended it with the same deliberate rhythm she used for weaving, a small twist of wrist, a branch laid in the right place, a pause to let the flames decide their shape. Oren sat nearby, shaping a spear shaft, the flint knife whispering against the wood with each stroke. Nima was grinding dried roots into powder for tomorrow's paste, her hands moving with a steady confidence that had no need for sight. Tarek stood at the edge of the fire's glow, scanning the tree line. The first stars were out, but their light was thin, fragile against the thickening dark. He could feel the night arranging itself, sounds shuffling into their proper places, scents taking on new edges. The predators would be moving soon, following the same routes they always did, invisible maps written in hunger and muscle memory. "Stay close to the light tonight," Tarek said without turning his head. His voice carried across the camp with enough weight that even the children heard the shape of the order behind the words. From the forest came the first sign, not the growl or scream of an attack, but the shifting silence of prey animals withdrawing. Somewhere in the reeds, a heron lifted into the air with a single strong wing beat, its alarm call sharp in the dark. Oren's knife stopped mid-stroke. Queso, who had been humming under his breath, let the sound fade. The smell arrived before the sound. It was faint at first, riding the edges of the breeze, musky, heavy, full of meat and old blood. Sarah noticed it too. Her hand paused over the fire, her eyes narrowing toward the dark. She reached for the spear beside her without looking at it. A low, rolling growl floated from beyond the light's reach. It was a sound that did not rush. It had no need. It was the voice of an animal that knew the power of its own patience. Tarek lifted his own spear and stepped forward until he was half in shadow, the fire painting one side of his face in gold, the other in black. He knew the predator would see him, would weigh him. Then came movement at the edge of vision, a large shape gliding between the trees, soundless except for the occasional whisper of grass parting under its weight. Its eyes caught the firelight first, a brief twin flare of amber, a lion, thick-necked and broad-shouldered, its mane dark and tangled, padded closer until its shape became clear against the shadows. It stopped just beyond the reach of the firelight, head low, tail sweeping lazily from side to side. The tribe did not scatter. They shifted subtly, forming a crescent with the fire at its heart, children and elders toward the back, hunters toward the front. Sarah's eyes never left the lion. Oren adjusted his grip on the spear shaft until the balance felt like a familiar conversation in his hand. The lion paced once, twice, its paws silent on the grass. Then it sat, the gesture deliberate, as if to say it had time to watch. Behind it, a second pair of eyes appeared, smaller, lower to the ground, a lion's muscles coiled under her tawny hide. She stayed farther back, her gaze fixed on the movement around the fire. Tarek knew what this was. They were testing the tribe, not for the first time. Predators understood territory, and they understood when another force moved within it. Tonight the lions had come to measure. For a long moment, the only sounds were the river's low voice and the crackle of the fire. Then from deeper in the forest, another call rose, a long haunting whoop that echoed across the valley. Hyenas. The lions' ears flicked, their attention splitting. The tribe held their ground. Queso began to hum again, low and steady, a sound older than words. It was not meant for the lions, it was for the tribe, a thread to hold onto. Nima joined in, her voice weaving under his, and the rhythm became a slow pulse in the dark. The lions moved first, turning her head toward the hyena's call. The male hesitated, eyes narrowing toward Tarek one last time. Then he stood, stretched and walked into the shadows, his body melting into the night, as if it had been made from it. The lioness followed, her steps soft but certain. The tension in the air loosened, though it did not disappear. The hyenas came later, their shapes slipped between the trees, their outlines broken by the flicker of the fire. They did not come as close as the lions, but their voices filled the dark, circling, testing. Oren muttered something under his breath, not an insult but a warning to himself to stay sharp. One hyena stepped forward, its head low, shoulders hunched. Tarek's spear angled toward it, and the animal paused, lips peeling back in a grin that was not friendly. The standoff lasted until the fire shifted, sending a burst of sparks into the air. The hyenas flinched back, then melted into the night, their calls fading into the distance. Slowly, the forest began to breathe again. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, Sarah placed another branch on the fire and said, "They will be back." "They always are," Tarek replied. The rest of the night was not quiet, but it was calm. The predators kept their distance, their eyes occasionally catching the light before vanishing. The tribe kept watch in pairs. The fire fed until dawn began to thin the shadows. When the first light touched the river, the night felt like a story already half forgotten, but the prince in the soft earth told otherwise. The clouds came low and close, as if the sky had decided to kneel. All afternoon they had been gathering in silent negotiations over the mountains, thickening into weight, learning the valley's shape the way a hand learns the curve of a bowl. By the time the sun slid behind the ridge, the world had narrowed to a dim, indefinite gray. No moon found its courage behind all that weather. Stars, if they were there, were thinking of other places. Night came down in a single soft piece. The river sounded larger, as rivers do when you cannot see them. It was a rope laid across the valley, pulled by invisible hands. Reeds shivered in small testaments to wind. A heron, late to choose its perch, scolded itself into the willow, and then made the necessary peace with its decision. In the hush beneath the rock overhang, the tribe built their fire carefully, feeding it with dry wood, saved for weather like this. Smoke, deprived of escape, hung under the stone and then drifted outward in slow, stubborn layers. Sarah squatted close to the flames, face glowed gold and shadow by turns, turning the strips of meat that had been cut thin and salted with crushed herb. Each strip hissed and tightened at the edges, beading clear fat that dripped down onto the embers and burst in small, celebratory sparks. Steam rose from a clay pot balanced on stones, where roots softened into a paste and water negotiated with starch. The smell was generous and direct. It told the body what it needed to hear. You will eat, you will warm, you will last. Tarek stood where light failed and night began, 1 foot inside, 1 foot outside, as if weighing the two countries. His spear was upright, point toward the sky, as if reminding the clouds that even the ground had opinions. He was not tense, but he was not loose either. He watched the tree line, which was not a line anymore but a sensation. He breathed a slow catalogue: damp stone, wet leaf, old ash, the faint musk of something that had passed earlier, and decided not to announce itself. Oren worked in the firelight, shaving slivers from a spear shaft with a flake so sharp it felt like a rumor. Every few strokes he lifted his head the way a deer lifts its head in tall grass, sudden, certain, then deciding nothing is wrong and returning to work while knowing that something is always wrong somewhere. Jara was mending a split in a basket rim, threading clean reed through old reed with the patience of a river making an oxbow. Queso murmured to a child about how the wind changes direction at night, and the child listened with his whole body because he was still at that age when knowledge fits into the shape of his bones. The fire's light worked the rock, limbing old soot stains, finding the handprints that lived like fossils near the ceiling, half jokes, half prayers from nights when laughter was just as useful as courage. Nima sat with her back against the stone, fingers blind and exact as she braided a length of sinew into something that would hold when a good knot met bad weather. Each of them carried the night in a different way, Tarek outward, Sarah by the flame, Oren in his restlessness, Queso inside a story, Nima inside a sequence of motions that made the present hold still. From the valley beyond the reach of the fire came the first new sound, not the footfall of stalkers, or the question mark of a branch breaking where no branch should. It was a hush, a placed hush, the space animals make when they nominate something as more important than themselves. The reed bed's constant whispering lost a layer, the frogs found a simultaneous breath and held it. Even the river seemed to slip briefly on a stone under its own skin. Sarah's head tilted a fraction. Oren's knife paused mid-whisper. Tarek did not move because moving would describe the moment too loudly. He did not even look at the others. He let the night speak in its... The smell arrived next, riding a slow eddy in the air, damp fur ash, a trace of fat smoke that did not belong to their fire, a human smell but not theirs. It strode past the more obvious scents and put its hand on the chest. Not threat, not welcome, a proposition. Sarah reached without drama for the spear near her knee. Jara's hands continued their work with reed but loosened, so the reed could become a whip or a strap if it had to. Queso adjusted how he sat, which made his shadow longer and the child's shadow vanish inside it. On the far edge of the clearing, where light ends by pretending it never began, a glow showed, small at first, then a little larger, a tongue of fire, not yet a statement, then another. The light traveled with bodies, slow and deliberate as old men crossing a river stone by stone. 3 figures came into the outskirts of the tribe's seeing, and as they did, the fire under the rock decided to speak up, throwing a little more of itself into the world so the strangers would know the tribe was not shy. They came as a triangle, 1 in front, 2 behind, all bearing torches no longer than a child's arm. The front figure was tall and had the permanent posture of a person who has learned to be both seen and obeyed. A collar of teeth, polished by time and habit, circled his neck like a domesticated storm. Stripes of ochre and charcoal braided his cheekbones and forehead, turning his face into an idea as well as a face. He stopped 12 paces from the tribe's fire. That distance wasn't an accident, it was the length of a thrown spear's thought. Tarek let the silence be the first greeting. Silence is an honest translator. Then the smallest of movements, he shifted his spear a thumb widths away from obvious readiness, and he let his shoulders fall as if breath had made them heavy. Not surrender, not challenge, a space. The tall stranger held his torch by its unburned end and slanted the flame toward the damp ground. Heat kissed wet earth. The torch hissed, then recovered, as if testing its own faith. The stranger tapped his chest. The gesture had a name in his tribe and a slightly different name in Tarek's, but bodies understand cousins of language. He pointed from his chest to the tribe's fire and paused. A request shaped to also be a test. Sarah's face was quiet. Oren's hand slid to the middle of his shaft where balance lives. Queso's eyes went to Tarek the way a river goes to sea. Tarek crouched, unhurried, and found a length of hardwood laid near the coals for such nights. He pushed one end into the nest of embers, lifted slowly until the end caught and became a blossoming orange certainty. For a second the fire glowed brighter, proud of its delegation. He stood, held the brand a heartbeat longer, letting the light touch the stranger's eyes so he could see how they accepted being seen, and then extended the burning stick across the 12 paces until he had crossed 6 of them, which is where a gift stops being a temptation. The tall stranger came forward those same 6 paces. Up close his breath smelled of waterweed and roasted marrow. His eyes were the color of burnt wood, and they did not blink when sparks rose and died between them in the air. He took the brand without taking Tarek's hand. He lifted it up and looked at it as if reacquainting himself with a friend who had learned new manners. He turned to his left and handed it to a companion, who stepped backward with the reverence of a man walking a sleeping child through a doorway. The tall stranger remained. He studied the woven mats, the thin strips of meat, the age-worn arrangement of stones, the place where children's heels had drawn 2 spirals in the dirt before sleep. He tapped his chest again, pointed at the fire, then touched 2 fingers to the ground. He gave the ground back its own name. Then he stepped into the dark and became it. The tribe did not draw breath in one sound. They ventilated that moment carefully with small private exhalations. Sarah turned the meat that had been waiting to be turned. Oren shaved a curl of wood almost as thin as onion skin and smiled at the blade's obedience. Queso murmured a word that might have been thanks and might have been remember. Tarek remained exactly where he was until the night, relieved of duty, began to fill its old shape again. When the stranger's branch of fire returned as a distant star moving low among trees, the tribe felt the returning of the world. But nothing that returns is as it left. Fire had crossed a gap. It had worn a different hand for a few minutes. It had seen other faces. That fact sat with them the way a 4th season would sit if it arrived 1 year unannounced. They came for flame, Sarah said at last. And for a way to look at us from near, Queso added, fire is a mirror for more than faces. They did not show teeth, Oren said. Nor did we. There's more to a mouth than teeth, Nima observed. Fingers moving but eyes on the space the strangers had left, and more to a hand than a spear. The wind turned, smoke crawled north along the stone before lifting. The fire lowered its shoulders, settled into work that did not need praise. Tarek circled the camp's edge, pausing at the places where a careless approach would feel welcome. He kicked small scree into gaps and laid lengths of thorn branch in low berms that would whisper a warning to bare ankles. He set 2 spare brands within a breath's reach of where Sarah kept flint and tinder, and he showed Oren without words where he wanted them if the night asked for sudden light. Clouds muttered to themselves over the mountains. A far strike of lightning opened and closed its eyes so quickly that only the heart noticed. The river carried that brightness for a long, slow beat, turning it into a rumor under its surface. Frogs, braver now that the strangers had passed, resumed naming their small kingdoms. The child Queso had kept under his shadow slid sideways in sleep, releasing a sigh that forgave the day everything. Watches turned. Oren took the second, because he wanted the hour when the world remembers it can be dangerous. Tarek allowed the wanting because some wants, if ignored, rot into mistakes. The night was darker than most, but even dark teaches shapes to those who practice. Oren learned again the difference between a hyena's swagger and a boar's low plow. He noticed where the reeds leaned against a wind that was not blowing. He heard sometime between one heartbeat and the next, the smallest of scratches travel across bark not far from his right shoulder. He did not look at it, he let the scratch become part of the scene. When it repeated, farther along, he turned his head and saw the raccoon-faced mask of a climbing animal pause, consider him with the disinterest of an equal, and continue upward. Toward the darkest center of night, rain finally solved itself, not a storm but a persuasion. Soft drops began, large and far apart, the first scouts of a patient army. The fire accepted them easily, spitting here and there, then growing more sure of its right to exist, as Sarah fed it with split wood that had been kept under a skin against such contingencies. The smoke changed its grammar, speaking more in the throat than the nose. Children turned in their sleep the way fish turn under a surface without disturbing it. Then the pounding that came was not rain, it was footfall, several bodies together, confident about their decision to be here. Oren's palm found the center of his spear. He breathed once and made that breath last for the count of 6 stones placed on the riverbank. The bodies moved along the edge of light, not into it. He saw shapes, shoulders, hips, the arch of a neck, then lost them. A grumble rolled through the reeds. Hyenas. Testing the narrow places, he lifted a brand with his free hand, and the fire obliged him with a piece of itself that fit perfectly in his grip. He did not throw it. He held it high and moved forward 3 paces, then 2, then 1, turning his shoulder so the light painted more of him than the spear did, so the hyenas would see a man who believed the fire belonged to him rather than the fire believing the man belonged to it. The nearest hyena laughed that head-back laugh, which is not a laugh at all, but an announcement, "We are still here." Then it found that the brand was brighter than the joke, and it slid back into the continuity of dark, taking its companions with it. The rain passed like a thought that can't justify itself. Clouds thinned. The darkness lifted enough to show the shape of near things. Oren held the brand until it took his wrist's ache, then set it back, unashamed of the ache. Nima relieved him without comment, and Oren slept the kind of sleep that mends small cracks. Before dawn, the strangers returned, not the same 3, or perhaps the same arranged differently by the night. Again the glow announced them first. This time there were 4. They stopped at the same 12 paces, as if the distance had been measured and agreed upon by all involved parties. The tall one was not with them. A woman stood forward instead, carrying a torch made. Tarek saw from a different wood, lighter, green sweating at the end, producing a smaller flame that needed a firmer wrist. Her face was painted in narrower lines, precise as reeds laid side by side. She did not tap her chest. She lifted the torch above her head and let the flame show her hair cut blunt across the shoulders, the scars along her forearm that traced an old bite.
Then she drove the torch down into damp soil at her feet and left it burning there like a polite request. With both hands free, she spread her fingers to show she carried nothing else. A second woman stepped to her side and did the same. Behind them, two men held spears, not high, not low, the posture of instruments rather than declarations. Tarek walked into the space between the two fires. He brought no spear, he brought his open hands. He stopped at 6 paces again. He bent, took a brand from their fire, lifted it, turned so its heat marched across his face, reminding him that life loves to be returned to. Then he walked forward 2 more steps and set the brand into their torch, lending it a new confidence. The woman nodded, a movement so slight it might have been the wind deciding to be seen. She reached toward her torch, pulled it up, and with quick, competent breaths fed the flame with shredded bark from a pouch at her hip. The torch repaid her by becoming what she had asked it to be. They did not leave right away. The woman's gaze roamed over the camp, measuring the meat strips, the arrangement of spears, the sleeping children, the story keeper, the old woman with the needles of bone in her hair, the quiet man without a weapon standing near as if he were the last step before a cliff. She spoke then, a short word contained in her mouth like a pebble. Tarek could not catch its meaning. He held its weight instead. He answered with a sound of equal size and temperature. She smiled with only one corner of her mouth, which in many languages means "we'll see." They departed like a change in weather rather than a group of people. The valley took their absence into itself the way the river takes rain, without ceremony, without denial. The tribe ate a small meal in the blue hour, when the world is still deciding what to call itself. The children woke one by one, some fast, some slow, carrying their dreams in their hair. Sarah rinsed the pot with river water and scrubbed its inside with a handful of sand, until the clay remembered its own surface. Fire is a bridge, Queso said, when there was space for words, and bridges carry in both directions. Not all bridges should be crossed, Oren answered, but there was no iron in it. There was a question mark at the end of the sentence where a spear tip might have been. We will not run over it, Tarek said. We will test each plank. The day gathered light as a net gathers fish. Clouds lifted their skirts off the mountains and showed a glimpse of blue, as if embarrassed by the night's dramatics. The fire settled to a handsome bed of coal. Ash whitened like old hair. The tribe dispersed into the chores that made them themselves. Jara checked traps upstream. Nima spread patch to dry on a line strung between 2 stubborn shrubs. Sarah took 2 children to cut reeds on the west bend, where the water flowed slower, and the stems grew clean and tall, without mud stains. Oren and Tarek walked the river's nearer bank, reading the night script. Here hyena tracks, light, circling. Here a deep print of a ball, toes splayed, a hint of irritation in the plunge of the hoof. Here human prints. The strangers had come as far as the shallow where the riverbed showed its ribs, then stopped. The prints of a child there too, small and light, toes splayed as if curious about cold water. Tarek touched the print with a fingertip, as if to see if any warmth remained. The child had danced in place, and then been scooped up. The deeper heel of an adult had found the same patch of sand, and asserted a different kind of belonging. They placed a second sign, a pattern of river shells and smooth stones, 2 arcs facing, with a third, smaller arc between them. In their tribe's language of ground, it meant we are willing to meet where the 2 edges touch in the middle. If the strangers read it as fish, or moon, or not now, so be it. Meaning is what stays when misunderstanding dissolves. By late morning, the day smiled with that shy grin certain days have when they think they have almost remembered a song. The wind tasted of far thunders that could not decide to commit. The tribe's fire was banked, not dead. Tarek knelt and turned over a coal with a stick, then replaced it, the way you would turn a sleeping child and tuck them again. He felt in the underside of his own ribs the new weight of responsibility, not just the hunger and safety of his people, but the grammar of a conversation with another tribe. Words had not yet met, still meanings had begun to pass. Toward evening, the sky grayed again. The valley held the color the way a bubble held completely, without asking permission from anything above it. The strangers did not come. Hyenas did, Briefly, a fox hunted frogs along the water's lip, leaving a cursive of prints that read "Still here." Sarah's hands found a rhythm at the hearth that the children's eyes started to imitate with their own small labor, pounding berries that would stain tongues purple and make sleep feel like a game they had won. Night returned less heavy but more aware. The fire took its role with the easy dignity of an old story. Queso began one, about the first time anyone had convinced dry grass to remember lightning. He told it without naming gods and without scolding, and in his version the hero was not the one who struck the spark, but the one who remembered to bring dry moss wherever she went. The children laughed at that in recognition, because they knew Sarah and they knew pockets and the way the world chooses keepers. Halfway through the telling, something changed in the air, and Tarek lifted his head. Not fear, not even warning, possibility. He stood. He laid a hand on Oren's shoulder, then on Sarah's back. He walked to the edge of light. From the trees, not torches this time, but the silver of eyes and the brown of skin under starlight, the tall stranger returned, and with him the woman who knew how to feed flame cleanly. They came with 5 more, 8 in all. They did not stop at 12 paces, they stopped at 10. They had crossed 2 steps of the bridge, and waited to see if it would hold. Tarek crossed 2 steps himself. He made sure the knight could see his empty hands. He obliged the knight by being patient. The strangers spoke among themselves, short syllables without flourish. The woman pointed to the very old soot on the rock, so old that this tribe's oldest story did not include its making. She touched the soot with 2 fingers, and brought those fingers to her mouth the way a child tastes rain. She smiled when the soot refused to have a taste. The tall man held up a small bundle. Tarek felt the bundle's meaning before he knew what was inside. When the man opened it, a folded hide, he took from it a neat nest of dry grass, hollowed at the center like the palm of a hand, and inside that grass a slice of fungus, the color of dusk. He mimed striking. He tapped his own stone to his spear tip, and made out of theater a spark that died as all performances do. He gestured to Tarek, "Teach me." The gesture said without humility, but also without arrogance, "Teach me your way, I will show you mine." Sarah moved like a bird that has made its decision, and will not revisit it. She brought flint. She brought a piece of ironstone she had traded seasons ago for a cloth dyed with crushed berries. She brought a ribbon of dried inner bark from a tree that is a friend to fire. She squatted opposite the woman. Their faces were 2 ends of a short story with a burning middle. Sarah placed the bark ribbon in the nest, rested the ironstone on her thumb, and struck flint. The spark landed, argued with the world as all sparks must, then found a corner of the ribbon, where argument and agreement are indistinguishable. Smoke lifted. Sarah breathed, not like a bellows but like a person who wants a child to blow stronger on a flute. The nest became a small star. She moved it to a waiting stick that had already been telling itself the tale of flame for a little while. The stick took the tale and enlarged it without bragging. The woman laughed, surprised and pleased by how quickly competence can leap the gap between strangers when the right materials align. She tried. Her first strike was timid, her second eager, her third correct. The spark landed in the coil of fungus, which smoldered like an animal taught to sleep on command. She lifted it, breathed it, counted something in her head that was older than numbers, and this time the nest blossomed as if embarrassed to have hesitated. The tall man nodded, which in his tribe was a bigger thing than applause. He set the lit nest into the crown of a torch that had been waiting in one of his companion's hands, and then held the burning end in the air, as if marking a place on a map of the dark. He pointed to the tribe's stones around the fire. He showed with quick movements of his palm how their own stones were arranged, closer together, higher, creating a throat that made smoke climb straight, rather than wander under rock. Tarek listened the way one listens to weather. He walked to the stone circle, and while everyone watched, he shifted one stone and then another, creating a narrower path for air. The fire said yes immediately, raising a slightly cleaner shoulder of flame. Queso grunted appreciation. Sarah's eyes flicked briefly to the tall man, who allowed himself a breath laugh that did not disturb the night. They did not stay long. You do not exhaust a good conversation the first time you discover you can talk. Before they left, the woman knelt and pressed her palm into a shallow ash bed. then lifted it. The ash made a print like a soft badge of belonging. She pressed that palm on the rock, lower than the old soot marks, in a place where rain would miss it for a few days. She looked at Tarek, who lifted his own palm and pressed it beside hers. 2 handprints, not a treaty, maybe the beginning of one. When they were gone, the camp did not break into chatter. They had more than enough to say. They did not need to spend it right away. Oren laughed once in a quiet, private way. Nima finished her braid and tied it off with a knot she had not used in years. Queso resumed his story, but it had learned a new detail while it waited. The hero now carried a packet of fungus as well as dry moss. The children liked this addition. It made the hero smarter, not just luckier. Near morning, rain threatened again and chose not to. The clouds rolled aside in one last slow turn of their shoulders, and the stars grew more numerous than a body can count without losing track of itself. Fire burned small and respectful and steady. Tarek sat near it for a long time, not looking into it the way some do when they want visions. He watched the place above it where heat makes the air ripple, where the world remembers it is not solid. He thought of bridges and hands in distances of 10 and 12 paces, and the weight of a brand moving from one tribe to another. He thought of how fire belongs to no one and to everyone at once, the way a river does, the way the wind does, the way stories do if you tell them well enough. He slept at last, and in the space where a watch ends and dawn is still undecided, Sarah took a small sealed ember from the fire's belly and slipped it into a clay container stuffed with dry bark and bound with hide. She shook it once, the way you shake a seed before planting, as if to ask it if it intends to behave. She placed it in the back of the shelter, where rain could not dream of finding it. Because bridges are good, and also, sometimes you need a boat hidden under the bank. The sky, when it finally softened, was the color of ash washed thin by river water. Birds tested their voices and accepted their own performances. The river carried reflections it had not been allowed to carry the night before. The valley stood up inside its own body and stretched. Fire, contained and content, breathed. If you have followed them this far, if you have felt the quiet bargain of flame passing from palm to palm, and the old patience of strangers learning to say yes in pieces, keep to their path. Return to this place when the light is new again so the line of the story doesn't fade between your steps and theirs.
The morning rose slow and deliberate, as if the world itself was reluctant to wake. Mist drifted lazily over the surface of the river, curling into thin threads before the warmth of the coming day could dissolve it. The air was damp, cool against the skin, and heavy with scents carried far across the water, mud stirred by unseen creatures, the sweet tang of crushed leaves, and something new, faint yet persistent, smoke. It was not the frantic, choking smoke of a forest fire, nor the sharp, bitter bite of green wood burning in haste. This was deeper, steadier, the smoke of many fires tended by many hands. Its presence lingered in the air like a low note that could not be ignored, humming beneath the softer music of the river and the forest. Tarek sat cross-legged beside the remains of their own fire, the embers pulsing with quiet life under a blanket of pale ash. His hands moved automatically, feeding small sticks into the glow until they caught, his eyes fixed on the far-off horizon. Above the tree line, the smoke rose in muted columns, bending with the wind before straightening again. It was too distant to be chance. It was a signal, intentional or not. It called to anyone with eyes to see it. Behind him, the tribe still slept in the shelter of the stone overhang. Sarah was the first to emerge, brushing her hair back from her face, her bare feet silent on the packed earth. She followed Tarek's gaze eastward, her brow furrowing. For a long time she said nothing. The morning did not require immediate words. "That is not from our valley," she said finally, her voice just above a whisper, as though anything louder might shift the shape of the moment. "No," Tarek agreed. "It is too much, and it has lasted too long." His tone was even, but his eyes stayed fixed on the drifting pillars. "They have gathered." Queso rose next, stretching slowly before walking to the river. He stepped into the cold water until it lapped at his ankles, head tilted slightly, as if listening for something more than sound. When he returned, droplets trailing from his skin, his face had changed. "It is not one fire," he said. "It is many, and they are not hiding from sight." There was no drawn-out debate. The choice to go toward the smoke was made with little more than glances and subtle movements. In this world, Delay was a kind of decision all its own, and rarely the right one. The preparations were quiet and swift. Nima bound her waist with her cord belt, testing the knot twice before letting it rest. Orin checked the bindings of his spear and the edge of his flint blade. The children were given small bundles to carry, light enough to keep their speed if they needed to run. The fire was banked with care, its heart buried under ash to preserve its life for their return. They set off eastward, following the slow bends of the river. The path was narrow at first, forcing them into single file. Willows leaned over the water, their long branches dipping and lifting with the current, scattering droplets in tiny arcs. The air smelled of wet stone and distant rain. Every so often, a bird burst from the brush ahead of them, wings flashing in the filtered light, only to settle again a short distance away, as if leading them forward. As the morning deepened, the trail began to widen. The ground told new stories, grass bent in broad swaths, earth pressed into shallow hollows by many feet. Prints overlapped in the mud near the water's edge, human, animal, and shapes blurred into anonymity. Here and there, a scatter of ash marked where a torch had been shaken, or a fire left to smolder. The voices reached them long before the camp itself came into view. At first they were only a low vibration beneath the murmur of the river, but soon they began to separate. Laughter, the quick rhythm of a child's cry, the steady knock of stone on wood. Then the trees parted, and the world opened. The clearing stretched wide beneath the open sky, dotted with fires whose smoke climbed in straight pillars, before curling into a single pale canopy overhead. Around each fire, people moved with a purpose that was neither hurried nor idle. Women tending spits heavy with meat, hunters working over hides stretched tight on frames, children weaving between them like water, finding every open path. Shelters of hide, reed, and woven grass stood in wide arcs, their doors all facing inward toward a central fire that burned taller and brighter than the rest. The people themselves were as varied as the materials of their shelters. Some wore cloaks of thick fur stitched with sinew, others layers of woven grass that whispered with every movement. Faces were painted in ochre, charcoal, and red earth, lines, swirls, and shapes whose meanings were older than any living voice. Some had the sturdy builds of mountain folk, their muscles shaped by steep climbs and heavy carries. Others were long-limbed, their bodies marked by the reach of nets and paddles. They were noticed almost immediately. A boy carrying a bundle of sticks stopped, eyes fixed on the newcomers. He dropped his load and ran toward the central fire, his voice lifting above the rest in words Tariq did not understand. Heads turned. From the shifting crowd emerged the tall man with the necklace of teeth, the one they had seen before. The woman with the gift for firecraft walked beside him, her gaze steady, her hair bound tight. They met at the edge of the clearing where the grass gave way to bare, trodden earth. The tall man raised both hands, palms open, his eyes scanning the faces before him. Tariq planted the butt of his spear in the ground and returned the gaze, his stance neither guarded nor open, balanced, waiting. The tall man tapped his chest, then swept his hand in a wide arc to encompass the camp. It was an invitation. Tariq tapped his own chest in response, his movement deliberate, acknowledging the gesture for what it was. Without another word, he stepped forward. His people followed, their eyes alive, but their hands resting easy at their sides. The camp adjusted to receive them. A log was rolled forward near the central fire, baskets shifted to make space. A woman came with water in a hollowed gourd, another with a strip of roasted meat, laid over a strip of bark. Sarah took them, tasting both before passing them to the others. Nima laid her spear on the ground at her feet, within reach, but pointed away from the gathering. Everywhere they looked, exchanges were taking place. A bundle of smoked fish was swapped for a slab of red meat. Two men compared the weight of their spears, swapping them back and forth with nods of appreciation. An old woman threaded beads into a child's hair, while murmuring something that made him grin. The tall man led them toward the great fire. It burned within a ring of stones blackened from long use, its flames rising and falling in time with the wind. Around it, people formed a wide circle. From across the fire came an elder, thin as a spear shaft, his skin creased in deep lines. His eyes were sharp, despite his bent back. When he spoke, his voice was low but carried, the rhythm steady and measured. Tariq could not understand the words, but the meaning was in the shape of the pauses, the sweep of the elder's hands toward the fire, and the people, the way his gaze held each face.
for a moment before moving on. When the elder finished, the tall man stepped forward, holding out his hand to Tariq. The space between them was closed in 3 strides. Tariq took the hand, the clasp firm and steady. It was not the seal of an agreement, but the opening of one. The circle dissolved into smaller gatherings. Sarah sat with the firecraft woman, weaving reeds into a mat. Oren examined spear points with 2 hunters, showing them the flint tips of his own. Nima learned a new knot for binding reeds, and in return showed a quicker way to strip bark for cord. As the sun lowered, the fires grew taller, their smoke merging into a single column that rose like a tree into the sky. The camp's noise shifted from work to the slower rhythm of evening. People sat close, sharing meat and stories, their faces lit in the same gold light. Children from different tribes ran together, their laughter unmarked by the boundaries their parents still felt. From the edge of the clearing, Tariq looked back toward the great fire. For this night, there were no strangers, only people whose names had yet to be spoken, and he understood that the river was not the only path worth following. The night after the gathering did not descend so much as it unfurled, layer by patient layer, until the clearing lay under a vaulted roof of smoke and stars. The last aurora of day clung to the river, turning its skin the color of hammered copper, then drifted into blue. Fires multiplied, each with its own temperament. Some crackled with impatient tongues, some burned low and disciplined, some popped resin like seeds deciding to become trees again. Smoke rose in quiet pillars and braided together high above, a slow, breathing ceiling shared by everyone who had come. Tariq stood at the camp's porous edge and watched the vast organism of people at work. It had a pulse. It had a circulatory system, paths that grew with use, trails that narrowed when they were no longer needed. It had a memory, where woodpiles had stood in the heat of afternoon, where a child had dropped a string of shells, where a pot had cracked and been set aside with reverence as if it were a limb that might heal. He felt the awareness he always carried, river and wind and prey and tooth, stretched to include new shapes, the radius of a stranger's reach, the places where a hand lingered a fraction too long near a weapon, the looseness in shoulders that meant a belly had been filled. He moved into the camp the way a careful animal moves from shade to shade, not hiding but respecting the gaze of things that were not his. Near one fire, a boy in a reed cloak bounced a small hoop of vine along the ground with a stick, turning each rebound into a new trick, until he misjudged and the hoop leapt toward the coals. A woman's hand snapped out and rescued it, heat blooming across her palm. She hissed, shook the sting away, then laughed because the hoop lived and so did the moment. The boy's relief was a bright animal. He placed the hoop on her head like a crown and ran on. At another fire, the smell of marrow hung close and generous. A man cracked bones with a river stone and tipped them so the glistening core slid onto a shard of bark. A girl face painted with tiny dots like an evening sky watched intently and copied his small twist of wrist. Not far beyond, 2 women pounded seeds into meal, their stones rising and falling like slow hearts. They paused occasionally to smile at a toddler who insisted on bringing them pebbles as if they were rare and essential. Sarah sat in a triangle of light with the woman whose braids had the authority of a crown. Between them lay a shallow basket rib, reed ribs splayed like sun rays. The woman showed a binding stitch Sarah had never used, pulling the weft with a tug that sealed the ribs tighter than Tariq would have thought possible. Sarah tried twice, failed without shame, tried a third time and felt the stitch catch, solid, inevitable. The women nodded together. The braid-crowned woman traced a tiny spiral in ash, and then drew another half a finger's width away. Sarah understood. 2 spirals, same center, your way and mine. She answered by setting down a reed and cutting 2 narrow slits opposite each other with a flake of flint, then threading a second reed through and cinching both with a twist that locked them. The woman inhaled softly, pleased. They worked on in a quiet as comfortable as fur. Oren hunched beside a man thick through the chest and neck, a tree that had decided to become human. The man's hands were gentle despite their size, turning a pale shaft of heartwood so the knife bit along the grain instead of across it. Here, Oren said, not in words but with his finger's angle and the tilt of his chin. The man shifted the blade 3 hairs to the left. The curl rose cleaner, a ribbon rather than a torn bark. Oren smiled without showing teeth. In the new spear's tapered end, the 2 men could already feel the line it would draw through the air months from now, a neat arc of decision,
Queso watched the near-silent language of the crowd with the caution of a man reading weather off bone and cloud. He saw fatigue diffuse sharp tempers, felt liquor laughter spiking and then settling, noted where people sat back to back in pairs, a trust posture but also a perimeter line. He did not worry the way anxious men worry. He listed a group in the tree line kept to themselves, 9 bodies 4 spears, their fire too efficient to be casual. They ate without sharing. Queso let the knowledge hang where it would dry into something useful later. From the clearing's heart a drum began, one skin stretched over a hollow that had learned across seasons the exact amount of anger and tenderness pressure should hold. The beat rose without hurry and seeded itself under conversations until even the river's voice learned to breathe in time. People stood, not all at once but in ripples. Tariq found his feet moving toward the largest fire as if a long route pulled them. The central fire towered, a standing testimony to this shared night. A ring of stones blackened by seasons gave it a throat. Air drew through, smoke climbed clean. The tall man with the tooth necklace stood near but not at the fore. The elder, sharp-eyed, reed-slim staff etched with spirals, stepped into the open. He did not pound the staff for attention. He tapped it once upon the stone and let silence come looking for his voice. His words had the cadence of mapped rivers. He spoke to each cluster in turn: mountain shoulders, long water limbs, reed singers, hide workers. He pointed rarely, and never at people, only at fire, at sky, at the place where the earth's skin rose into a ridge, at the river's bend. He told of why they had come this season, of who had lost whom, of who had been found. He recited the names of animals as if apologizing to each, then thanking each for the same reasons. A baby cried and fell silent, listening like everyone else. When he finished, a woman with white lines painted top to heel stepped forward. She did not speak. She stepped into the drum's second voice and let her own bones remember what ground feels like when you are teaching it to trust you. Her feet measured the earth in small exactnesses, toes testing what the heel promised. Fingers drew arcs and scrapes in the air, tracing old maps of hunger and shelter and water. Others joined, respectful of her axis. They did not mimic. They added wind to her fire, iron to her song. Sira stood beside Tariq and moved one hand with the dancer, counting without numbers. Across the ring, Oren leaned slightly forward as a young hunter shifted weight from heel to ball, setting a lesson in his legs. The dance ended by arriving at stillness. The drum kept one more heartbeat and then rested. No shout, no clatter. The world returned to its collection of smaller worlds. Conversation resumed with the softness that follows solved weather. Tariq drifted riverward, the night opening around him. Moonlight laid a thin silver along the water's surface. Each slow ripple carried fragments of fire like tiny shipwrecks rowing into darkness. He crouched and wet his hands. The river's cold set its teeth into his skin and held until he surrendered the day's heat. Behind him the camp remained, tens of small suns, all breathing. Sarah came with food wrapped in leaves. They ate without hurry. We could learn, she said, not as a proposal but as a verdict. Reality had already reached. Knots, drafting the smoke. The reed stitch. We will, Tariq said, and they will learn our slowness. He meant the kind of slowness that outlasts fear, the patience in stalking, the tolerance for silence that allows truth to speak at its own speed. Queso arrived as the moon pulled up a degree. Not all is feast, he said, as if commenting on weather. Tariq followed the line of his gaze. The group under the trees had grown by 2. They had arranged their fire low, dug into a shallow, so the light licked their faces rather than writing them in gold. They spoke without moving their arms. 2 of them wore their hair cut square against the jaw. One chewed on a reed, another had a string of bones that were not animal around his wrist. Tariq filed the measurements. He did not adjust his face. Tomorrow, Queso added. The testing begins when bellies remember they have other work. Tomorrow we talk, Tariq said. Tonight we keep the middle. They walked the perimeter without making a perimeter obvious. It was a walk along a necklace's cord, checking that each bead rested where it should. In one corner a small scuffle had collected on its own. Oren stepped in with 2 palms pressed outward, a gesture that means let the air through. A man with mountain shoulders and a boy with too much courage had disagreed about whether a spear's point needed to be that sharp in a crowded place. Oren took the spear, turned its weight, held it under his own chin, and shook his head. He scraped the edge with a smooth stone until it sang less. He handed it back. The boy's cheeks colored in the firelight, then cooled. At the craft fires the conversations were longer than hunger. Sarah traded a coil of cordage for an edge of flint. She hadn't seen napped that way before, thin, with a secret its maker had not completely shown. The woman with the braid crown grinned and shrugged. You will find it in your hands or you will not. Nima learned how to wrap a bundle of reeds so tight water could ride on it like a plate without spilling. In return, she showed a trick of folding hide corners that embarrassed corners into obedience. Past midnight, a thin weather moved in, the kind of breathless air that hints at rain while promising none. The smoke gathered lower, and conversations nested under it. The children drifted to sleep one by one under different skies, on hides, on mats, under clumsy cloaks thrown over reeds. Their trust in the nearness of so many strangers was a quiet law the adults enforced without speaking. A boy awoke crying from a dream that left salt on his face. The old woman with ash hair hummed a line only the boy and the night could hear. The boy's breath decided to become regular again, and the dream retreated to its own fire. At the tree line, a hyena tested the courage of a discard heap. Its laugh arrived late, like thunder traveling proudly behind its lightning. A ring of men stood without rising, and lobbed stones airlight, not to hurt, but to move the hyena's map. It moved reluctantly, as if refusing to admit that men with fire were heavy things. By the great fire, the elder's staff lay across his knees, and his eyes were half closed in the witness of people doing what people do when they are not asked to run. The tall man with the tooth necklace knelt in conversation with a woman whose hands had scars in the places where fish spines like to argue. They drew maps in ash, the river's bend, a stand of fig trees, a place where stone remembers the hand that freed it. Tariq returned to Sarah. Tomorrow, he said. She nodded. He meant it. Tomorrow we will name out loud what we are silently agreeing on now. Toward the darkest hour, the camp learned the cost of so much light. Wind turned in its sleep, and a torch toppled at the edge of a reed shelter, catching a lip of dried grass. Flame ran along that line like a child delighted with a new stick. Someone shouted. The shout grew, feet and ran. Water skins came, hands slapped, cloaks smothered. For a moment the clearing forgot it was many and became one. Arms passing skins, voices splitting and recombining, the drum ripping a new pattern that meant here, now. Tariq and Oren were in the smoke. The tall man tore a shelter down faster than it had been raised. Sarah threw wet mud where flame liked to climb. Nima pushed children backward with a tenderness that contained iron. When it was done, the fire sulked under dark foam, ashamed of how exciting it had been. People stood breathing, shoulders high, eyes bright, as if they had been asked a sudden question by the night and had answered correctly by accident. The woman whose shelter had burned held a charred reed between two fingers the way you hold a lesson. She laughed once, not because it was funny, but because her body needed an exit for what had just been inside it. Hands found her shoulder and left messages there. Still here, still many, still heat. The camp returned to its former shape, but not the same. There was a shared story now with soot on it. Suspicion moved 2 finger widths down. Gratitude rose by the same measure. The group in the trees shifted, conferring. One of them stood and walked 3 paces nearer the middle, then 3 more. He stopped short of the fire's confidence, but he had not stayed where he had been. Keizo noticed, in the new quiet, a ritual began that had not been mentioned. The elder stood, took a coal with tongs of green wood, and set it into a shallow bowl of clay. The coal breathed instead of burned. He held it like a newborn moon, and walked the circle's inner edge. He stopped at each group, and at each he turned the bowl so heat could nod toward different faces. When he came to Tariq, he did not offer the bowl, he tilted it. Tariq leaned close enough to feel a sting on his cheek. He did not flinch. The elder smiled, which looked like a crack arranging itself into a river. He passed on. Later still, food resumed as the law of mercy. A thick stew ladled into bark boats, meat crisp from a grate, roots smashed into a paste made holy by hunger. Sarah tasted a leaf she did not know, wrapped around a mouthful of fish that had been taught to smoke the way a hill is taught to hold snow.
She committed the taste to the place where memory and tongue shake hands. Oren traded a promise to show a snare knot in the morning for a cluster of berries with a tang that reminded him of storms. Now and then languages brushed each other and left marks. A boy with a scar on his lip pointed at a tool Tariq carried and said a word that had tall vowels and a short exit. Tariq repeated it. The boy laughed and corrected the corner of Tariq's mouth. Tariq tried again. The boy nodded, satisfied, and ran off, having decided the day had taught enough. Clouds thinned at last, and the sky showed its old stories. The smoke made the stars look farther than usual, which made the world under them feel nearer. A woman sang, not to gather people, but to settle the ones already gathered. Her voice traveled without striving. The tall man pressed 2 fingers into the ash, then touched them to his chest and to the ground. The woman with the braid crown fell asleep, sitting up, reeds still threaded through her fingers. Keizo finally exhaled the breath he thought he had lost earlier and did not bother to find again. Tariq returned to the river. Sarah followed as if the river were a sentence she had not finished reading. They crouched and he splashed his face, and she pressed her palm to the wet stone so her lifeline and the river's might overlap. "We will go home," she said. It was not a question. Homes do not like being left alone for long. "But we will not go back as we left. We will carry their stitches," Tariq said, "and the way they make stones speak air, and perhaps their way of standing when the world tries to burn itself down," Sarah added, half smile in her voice. He looked back at the camp that was beginning to dream. "And they will carry our waiting." A fish rose and wrote a brief bright word on the river's skin. A child far behind them called out once in sleep and immediately corrected herself. The land turned its enormous shoulder to face the next part of itself. Dawn, when it began to assemble, did so without drama. A line of uncolored light arrived first, strengthening quietly. The smoke that had been a roof turned into columns again, then into isolated ribbons, then into nothing but memory in the hair. The fires settled to beds of cold with the calm of old animals lying down. People stirred, testing ankles, reminding fingers what cord feels like in the morning. Tariq stood, joints answering like friendly doors. Oren was already awake, squinting into the grey with a hand over his eyes as if catching light. Keizo flexed his toes in the damp grass and spoke to his knees as if they were stubborn friends. Sarah shook the last ash from a woven mat and rolled it tight. They would leave after food. The river would receive their footprints and then change its mind about them. The valley would be where it had always been, surprised anyway to see them. But as they moved back through the camp's soft waking, people touched them lightly as if to confirm the tribe existed outside the night. A hand on Tariq's forearm, one of the tree shook men, a nod from the elder, small as a seed, heavy as a hill. The braid-crowned woman pressed a wrapped bundle into Sarah's hand, reeds cut at the right moon. Sarah answered with a coil of cordage sealed with rendered fat. The woman lifted it to her nose, inhaled, then smiled in a way that belonged to both of them now. At the last margin, where trampled ground remembered grass and grass pretended it had never known feet, the group from the trees waited. Their leader, square-haired, bones on his wrist, stepped forward a single pace. He met Tariq's eye without making it into a contest. He touched his own chest once, then made a very small circle in the air that included Tariq, then himself, then the river. He stepped back again. It was not friendship, it was not threat, it was the line that is drawn before both. Keizo nodded, not to the man, but to the shape of that line. They walked out along the river path, carrying fire, stitches, knots and the rhythm of the drum in their bones. Behind them the camp grew small in the trees, then folded itself into the land like a secret the earth didn't mind keeping. Ahead, mist lifted off the water as if it had heard their feet and wanted to see who was coming. They did not speak much. There was no need. The river spoke enough for a while, and when it grew quiet again, the birds took over. By the time the sun admitted its full self into the sky, the tribe had already measured the distance between who they had been and who they were now, and agreed to forgive the difference its clumsiness. They would be back. Bridges were not made to be admired from one bank.